Carlos Almeida sat in his leather armchair in the study of his luxurious London apartment, but the comfort of his surroundings contrasted sharply with the weight in his chest. Only 2 weeks remained until the event that would mark the pinnacle of his life, his wedding to Marina Souza, daughter of one of the most influential businessmen in England. Everything seemed perfect, or should seem perfect. Carlos's world had changed dramatically since the days when he sold sweets with his mother in a humble neighborhood of East London. Now he was a respected entrepreneur with a life that seemed to have stepped out of a glossy magazine. Still, as he reviewed the guest list with Marina and her mother, Lady Aurea, an uncomfortable restlessness settled in his mind. "We can't forget to include someone very special," Aurea suggested, looking at Marina with a sharp smile. "Who?" Carlos asked, distracted. "Luciana Silva, your former—" Marina replied with a tone bordering on sarcasm. "Why not show her how much you've evolved?" "It's almost poetic." Carlos frowned, surprised by the suggestion. Marina loved to provoke him with memories of his humble past, but the idea of inviting Luciana seemed to cross any boundary. "Is this serious?" he questioned, looking directly at Marina. "Of course, my love. After all, you owe her so much, don't you?" Marina retorted, her voice impregnated with irony. Lady Aurea intervened before Carlos could protest. "Luciana was an important part of your life, son. She helped you when no one else believed in you. Wouldn't it be fair to invite her to see the incredible person you've become?" Carlos didn't respond immediately. He knew Marina and her mother's intentions were far from noble. Inviting Luciana would be an opportunity to reaffirm his success, in contrast to the limitations of his past. But there was something more. The mention of Luciana brought forth a whirlwind of memories. He remembered their shared laughter, the naive plans they made for the future, and how she always encouraged him to believe in himself. Thinking of her now in such a different context was like revisiting a purer version of himself. "I'll think about it," he finally said, trying to end the conversation. Marina shrugged as if she had already won the battle. "Excellent. I'm sure it will be interesting." That night, Carlos revisited the invitation again. The list was full of important names, Marina's friends, business contacts, celebrities. It was a perfect portrait of the new social circle he had built, but Luciana's name wouldn't leave his mind. He picked up the phone, hesitated for a moment, and then dialed the number. It was an impulsive gesture, but he needed to resolve this. "Hello?" Luciana's voice sounded from the other ray. Familiar and calm. Carlos felt a lump in his throat but maintained a formal tone. "Hi Luciana, it's Carlos." There was a brief but meaningful pause. "Carlos, I wanted to know if you would accept coming to the wedding." The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, Luciana responded, her voice measuring each word. "Congratulations on your wedding. Of course, I accept the invitation." Carlos thanked her, but when he hung up, he realized his heart was beating faster than it should. After the call, Carlos sat thoughtfully alone in the room. He picked up an old photograph he kept hidden, a photo of him and Luciana in front of the park, where they used to dream of a better future. He wondered if that invitation had been a good idea or just an attempt at reconciliation with himself. Meanwhile, Luciana Silva still held her phone even minutes after the call with Carlos had ended. His words echoed in her mind, mixing old memories with the reality of her present. She hadn't seen Carlos in more than a decade, and the idea of attending the wedding of the man who had once been the love of her life seemed both absurd and inevitable. Sitting in the small but cozy living room of her flat in South London, she stared at the pile of papers on the table. Luciana was now a history teacher at a local public school. Her life was simple but fulfilling, filled with achievements she had conquered on her own through effort and resilience. Still, something about Carlos's call bothered her. It wasn't just the invitation itself, but the hesitant tone he had used, as if the words carried more weight than they appeared. The next morning, Luciana met Carla, her best friend, at the cafe where they usually gathered on Saturdays. Carla was a vibrant presence in her Life with strong opinions and a unique ability to bring perspective to any situation. "He invited you to the wedding!" Carla exclaimed, almost dropping her coffee cup. "And you didn't hang up on him?" Luciana shrugged, laughing nervously. "I was surprised, to say the least. I don't know what to think." "Think? It's a surprise to hear your voice after so long." "Yes, I'm calling because I'm getting married." "There's nothing to think about, Lou," Carla responded, gesturing emphatically. "This guy left your life years ago. Now he shows up out of nowhere with a rich and arrogant fiancé and thinks he can invite you to what exactly? Be a trophy of comparison." Luciana remained silent for a moment, stirring the spoon in her teacup. "Maybe that's exactly why I should go." Carla leaned back in her chair, confused. "What do you mean?" "It's not about him or about Marina," Luciana explained, her voice firmer. "It's about me. For a long time, I hid from the memories of what happened between us. But I'm not the insecure girl from years ago anymore. I have my own life now, my achievements. If they expect to humiliate me, they'll be surprised." Carla stared at her for a few seconds before letting out a sigh. "All right, but you promise you'll go with your head held high?" "No hesitation. No doubt?" "I promise," Luciana responded with a confident smile. That night, Luciana looked at herself in the full-length mirror in her bedroom. It was as if she was evaluating who she had become over the years. The young woman full of dreams and insecurities was still there somewhere, but now mixed with a woman who had faced challenges and grown through them. She remembered how Carlos was in their youth, ambitious, dreamy, but pure. They shared a deep bond, but their divergent ambitions had separated them. Carlos wanted to leave the neighborhood at any cost. Luciana wanted to find happiness wherever she was. When she finally decided to accept the invitation, it was as if something inside her had resolved itself. It wasn't about Carlos or Marina, but about proving to herself that she was strong enough to face the past without fear. The days leading up to the wedding were intense. Luciana reserved time to take care of herself, something she rarely did. She went to the hairdresser, bought an elegant but discreet dress, and even tried on shoes that matched her personality, comfortable but sophisticated. Carla, of course, was by her side the whole time, offering opinions on every detail. "This dress screams, 'I'm amazing, but I don't need to rub it in anyone's face,'" she said, approving the final choice. Luciana laughed, feeling lighter. "That's exactly what I want to convey." On the eve of the wedding, Luciana felt a pang of doubt. What if she was making a mistake? What if Carlos and Marina were just waiting to see her fail? She picked up her phone but didn't call Carla this time. Instead, she looked again at the old photograph she kept in a drawer, the same one that Carlos probably still had, both of them smiling in the park. Taking a deep breath, she decided she wouldn't be a prisoner of the past anymore. The Luciana who would attend that wedding was a woman who owed no explanations to anyone, least of all to the past. The brilliance of sunlight reflected off the golden chandeliers of the luxury hotel ballroom where Marina Souza and Lady Aurea supervised the final details of the wedding. The environment exuded luxury and perfection, with arrangements of rare flowers and crystals gleaming in every corner. Marina moved with nervous energy, incessantly checking the planning. "I want everything to be impeccable," Marina said, looking at the decorator with cold eyes. "This wedding isn't just about us. It's about showing who we are." Lady Aurea, beside her daughter, observed with satisfaction. "Luciana will be here," she reminded her. "She will realize, just like everyone else, what she could never have." Marina displayed a satisfied smile. There was something almost theatrical about the idea of contrasting her opulence with the simplicity she expected to see in Luciana. For her, this was a victory, even before it began. Meanwhile, Carlos was in his office reviewing reports that couldn't hold his attention. His mind was a storm of disconnected thoughts, all revolving around Luciana. He couldn't stop remembering the sound of her voice during the call. It was both familiar and distant, like a melody he knew but hadn't heard in years. She wasn't the same Luciana he had left behind, and this perception left him restless. He dropped the papers, leaning back in his chair. The memories pulled him toward a past he tried to avoid, but now seemed more present than ever. He remembered the time she found him discouraged after being rejected in his first attempt to get an internship. Luciana had held his hands, looking directly into his eyes, and said, "You are much more than they see now. They can't see what you're capable of becoming." At the time, those words were a comfort, but now they seemed to carry a different weight. He wasn't sure if she would be proud of the man he had become. Marina's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Carlos, are you there?" She entered the office without waiting for a response, holding a tablet with images of the wedding decoration. "I want your opinion on this." Carlos looked at the photos, but his mind wasn't processing what he saw. He just nodded, mumbling something that sounded like approval. Marina noticed his distraction. "Is everything all right?" He hesitated but shook his head. "Of course, I'm just tired." Marina observed him for a moment before turning her attention back to the tablet. For her, the wedding. Details were more important than her fiancé's mood swings. The ballroom was already full when Luciana arrived. Animated conversations filled the air, while waiters moved silently among the guests, carrying crystal flutes and fine appetizers. The decoration was impressive, a combination of exotic flowers and lighting that seemed designed to create a spectacle. Luciana paused at the entrance, adjusting her dress with a light touch on the sides. She took a deep breath, keeping focused on herself. The first step was always the hardest, but when she entered, each look that turned in her direction seemed to lose strength in the face of her presence. Elegance was the word that defined her. There were no excesses in her appearance, just a deep blue dress, a classic hairstyle, and a serene look that conveyed self-confidence. However, it was this that made her presence so striking. The whispers began almost immediately. Some guests, clearly from Marina's circle, exchanged glances while analyzing Luciana. Others seemed intrigued, curious to know who was this woman who radiated a sophistication that contrasted with the ostentatious brilliance of the event. Carlos was at the back of the ballroom when he saw her. He was talking to a group of business colleagues, but his words died in his throat as soon as his eyes found Luciana. It was as if time had slowed down. She was different, and yet there was something deeply familiar about her. Carlos felt a wave of emotions he couldn't completely identify. Admiration, regret, and something deeper, something he didn't want to admit to himself. Marina was beside her mother when she noticed the commotion. Following the guests' gazes, she saw Luciana. Her eyes narrowed, but she quickly adjusted her expression to a calculated smile. "Look who decided to show up," Marina said in a low, venomous tone. Lady Arya gave a short laugh. Well, at least she had the decency to dress appropriately. But let's see how she handles the night. Luciana, meanwhile, maintained her composure as she walked through the ballroom. She knew she was being watched, but her confidence didn't waver. With each step, she reaffirmed to herself that she wasn't there to prove anything to anyone, just to show that her past no longer defined her. A waiter stopped beside her, offering a glass of champagne. Luciana thanked him with a smile and accepted. She knew she was entering hostile territory, but she wouldn't show it. "Luciana?" Carlos's voice interrupted her. Thoughts. She turned slowly, finding him a few steps away. He was exactly as she remembered, more mature, more polished, but still with that gleam in his eyes that always distinguished him. "Carlos," she responded with a slight smile. "Congratulations on the wedding." Carlos hesitated for a moment, as if her words had hit something inside him. "Thank you." But the exchange was loaded with meaning. Carlos felt the urge to say more, but was interrupted by Marina, who appeared at his side with a large, possessive smile. "Ah, so you're the famous Luciana," Marina said, extending her hand. Luciana shook her hand, maintaining the same polite tone. "And you must be Marina." Marina tilted her head slightly, as if analyzing Luciana's words. "Thank you. We made sure it would be an unforgettable event. I hope you're comfortable." "I am, thank you," responded Luciana, with a smile that seemed to disarm any attempt at provocation. The reception dinner was the highlight of the night. The ballroom lights were adjusted to create a warm, inviting glow that cast reflections on the crystal glasses and silver cutlery impeccably arranged on the long tables. Guests murmured in animated conversations while waiters distributed elaborate appetizer plates. Luciana was led to a seat strategically placed in the center of the room, far from Carlos but close enough for everyone to observe her. Marina, with a calculated smile, had personally supervised the dinner planning. She wanted to ensure that Luciana was surrounded by the most critical and mordacious friends from her social circle. "I hope you enjoy the food, Luciana," Marina said as she passed by the table, her smile appearing innocent but with a malicious gleam in her eyes. "It's quite different from what you must be used to, I imagine." Luciana raised her eyes, meeting Marina's with a disconcerting calm. "Good food is always welcome, Marina. What matters is who we share the table with, don't you think?" Marina hesitated for a brief moment, but managed to maintain her smile. Of course. I hope you feel at ease." She walked away, but the tone of her words lingered at the table. Some guests laughed softly, while others exchanged embarrassed looks. Luciana, however, seemed unshakable. The dinner proceeded with Marina trying to direct the conversation to topics that highlighted the differences between her life and Luciana's. "So, Luciana," Marina began, leaning forward slightly, "I heard you're a teacher. Must be rewarding, I imagine." Luciana calmly placed her fork down before responding. "Yes, it is. Teaching isn't just a profession, it's a vocation. Seeing my students understand the world in a broader way is one of the greatest rewards I can have." Marina laughed softly, tilting her head to the side. "How charming. And did you always want to be a teacher, or was that more of an adaptation?" There was a brief silence around the table. Some of the guests who had been captivated by Luciana during the night now watched attentively, waiting for her response. Luciana smiled, maintaining her serene tone. "I always wanted to make a difference. Teaching was a conscious choice, not an adaptation. Circumstances change, but our values remain." The response left Marina speechless. From across the ballroom, Carlos watched the interaction, feeling a mixture of pride and discomfort. He knew what Marina was trying to do, and the fact that Luciana handled it with such dignity only reinforced the difference between the two women. Not satisfied with losing control of the conversation, Marina changed tactics. "You're right about values," she said with a sharp edge to her voice. "When I think about values, I think about the importance of working hard to achieve our dreams, no matter what it costs." Luciana raised her water glass and took a slow sip before responding. "I completely agree, Marina. True success comes when we don't lose sight of who we are while working to achieve our dreams." The simple but sharp response made some of the guests disguise smiles, while others looked at Marina, waiting for her reaction. Carlos felt something stir inside him. The way Luciana responded, not with attacks but with confidence and authenticity, highlighted even more the superficiality he now saw in Marina. The breaking point came when Marina, apparently losing patience, decided to make a more direct provocation. "I was wondering, Luciana, how do you feel here among, well, let's say, so many people from a world so different from yours?" Luciana leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table with elegance. Her eyes were calm but carried an intensity that made Marina step back a little. The world might seem different, but people are the same, aren't they? What differentiates us isn't where we come from, but how we choose to treat others. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table, but was quickly filled by someone clapping. It was Beatrice Mendoza, half of the gallery owner couple that Luciana had impressed earlier. "Well said, Luciana," she exclaimed with a smile. "It's rare to find someone with such a clear and articulate vision these days." Other guests nodded in approval, and Marina, realizing that the conversation had completely escaped her control, forced a smile and returned to focusing on her plate. Meanwhile, Carlos felt a lump in his throat. He observed Luciana, who was now engaged in an animated conversation with the guests around her, and couldn't avoid the comparison between her and Marina. Luciana seemed to shine with an authenticity that made everything around her seem emptier. Marina, on the other hand, tried to disguise her frustration. She looked at Carlos from across the room and noticed that he was fixed on Luciana. That made her stomach turn, but she knew she couldn't lose her composure. When dinner ended, many guests approached Luciana to compliment her on her intelligence and grace. One of the most respected businessmen in the room even commented to Carlos, "This Luciana, what an impressive woman. You're lucky to know her, Almeida." Carlos just smiled, but the words resonated within him more deeply than the man could imagine. As the night progressed, Marina realized that Luciana's presence was destabilizing more than she had predicted. Her humiliation strategy had failed, and now she didn't know how to regain control. Luciana, in turn, left the dinner stronger than ever. Not only had she faced Marina and emerged victorious, but she had also earned the respect of people she never imagined impressing. And Carlos, in the midst of it all, began to wonder if the life he had built, so focused on status and appearance, really meant anything. The dinner was over, but the night was far from ending. The guests began to spread out across the main ballroom, enjoying the drinks and soft music that filled the environment. Luciana, maintaining her calm and centered demeanor, walked with serenity, conversing with people who approached her. What began with curious looks and subtle judgments during her arrival had now transformed into something completely different. Guests who initially seemed skeptical were clearly intrigued by her. Her confident but accessible posture and her ability to navigate both deep and light conversations captivated everyone around her. The soft glow of the moonlight filtered through the terrace windows as Carlos watched Luciana from across the room. The brilliance of the evening lights reflected off her blue dress as she gracefully moved among the guests. She seemed so comfortable, so authentic, as if she existed in a world apart from the suffocating, luxurious environment he had created for himself. He had delayed the moment for hours, but finally gathered courage. He took advantage of a pause in the conversations around Luciana when she stepped away to the terrace, seeking a moment of silence. Carlos followed her, hesitant but determined. The terrace was illuminated only by moonlight and stars. A light breeze carried the fragrance of the garden flowers below. Luciana was leaning on the railing, lost in thoughts. "May I join you?" Carlos asked, breaking the silence. Luciana turned slowly, surprised but not shaken. She simply nodded, gesturing to the empty space beside her. "Of course, Carlos." For a moment, neither said anything. Carlos looked at the horizon while Luciana studied his face glancingly, trying to understand why he was there. "You did very well tonight," Carlos began, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I think I already knew you would impress everyone, but seeing it was different." Luciana smiled slightly. "Thank you, but I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm just being myself." Carlos shook his head, laughing softly. "That's always what you did, wasn't it?" "That you tried to be something you weren't?" she asked calmly. Carlos sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know anymore, Luciana. At the time, all I wanted was to get out of where we were, achieve more, be more. And now that I'm here..." He paused, searching for words. "It seems I lost myself along the way." There was another moment of silence. Luciana's breathing was calm, but her heart was racing. "You got what you wanted, Carlos. Built the life you dreamed of." He looked at her, his face revealing a mixture of regret and longing. "But at what cost?" "I abandoned who I was and left you behind." The intensity of his words made the air between them feel heavier. Luciana felt a lump in her throat but maintained her composure. "You did what you thought you needed to do, Carlos. I can't blame you for that." Carlos turned to her, his eyes seeking hers. "But you can. And maybe you should. Luciana looked away, trying to process what he was saying. Finally, she spoke. I don't blame you, Carlos, but I won't lie either. It was hard to understand why you chose to move forward without looking back. Carlos took a step closer, his voice laden with emotion. It was because I was afraid that if I stayed, I would never be enough. I thought I needed too much to be happy. But Luciana, the truth is, I was happier by your side than I've ever been since then. These words hung in the air between them. Luciana felt tears forming but didn't let them fall. That was a long time ago, Carlos. We've both changed. You changed for the better, he responded firmly, and I don't even know who I am anymore. Luciana finally looked at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. Maybe that's what you need to discover. There was a long silence while Carlos absorbed her words. He knew she was right. And what about you? He finally asked. Do you still feel something for me? Luciana, hesitated, feeling the weight of the question. Carlos, I don't know. Seeing you today, hearing all this, brought me back to a place I thought I had left behind. But I also remember how it was when you left me. I don't know if I can go through that again. Carlos took another step in her direction, the pain evident in his eyes. I should never have left you, Luciana. I know that now. She took a deep breath, trying to stay firm. It's not that simple, Carlos. It's not just about where we went wrong, but who we are now. You need to know who you are before you know what you really want. He nodded reluctantly but understanding. Maybe you're right, but if there's any chance to fix things between us, I'll try. Luciana didn't respond immediately. She knew there was a connection between them, something that had never completely disappeared, but she also knew she couldn't let herself be carried away just by what she felt. Let's see what the future holds for us, Carlos, she finally said. But for now, I think we need to understand who we are separately before thinking about what we could be together. Carlos nodded again, realizing she was right, even if it hurt him. Thank you for talking to me, Luciana. Thank you for being honest, Carlos. It's a good start. They stayed there for a few more moments, the silence between them now more comfortable. And then, slowly, Luciana returned to the ballroom, leaving Carlos alone on the terrace, lost in thoughts, but with a new determination rising within him. When they returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had changed. The soft music still played, but there was a tension in the air that couldn't be ignored. Marina, who had been watching from afar, approached Carlos with a forced smile. Where have you been, darling? Being yourself while I tried to be everything I wasn't. Luciana didn't respond immediately, just observed him. The vulnerability in his voice was something she hadn't expected. Is that how you feel? Everyone's asking about you. Carlos looked at her, seeing for the first time how different she was from what he truly wanted in life. Marina, we need to talk. She tensed, recognizing the tone in his voice. Now? In the middle of our wedding reception? Yes, now, he said firmly, because I can't continue with this. Marina's eyes widened as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. You can't be serious. I am, Carlos replied, his voice steady. I can't marry you, Marina. It wouldn't be fair to either of us. The words hung in the air like a heavy curtain. Marina's face transformed from shock to anger. It's because of her, isn't it? Because of Luciana? Carlos shook his head. No, it's because of me. Because I finally understand who I am and what I really want in life. Marina stared at him, tears of anger forming in her eyes. You'll regret this, Carlos. But as she stormed away, Carlos felt lighter than he had in years. He looked across the room at Luciana, who was preparing to leave. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, both knew that while their story wasn't over, it was about to begin again in a completely different way. 3 months had passed since the night of the interrupted wedding. The London autumn painted the streets with golden leaves as Carlos walked through his old neighborhood in East London. He had made significant changes in his life since that night. He sold his luxury penthouse and moved to a modest but comfortable flat in a quieter area of the city. The first step was reconnecting with his roots. He began visiting his old neighborhood regularly, talking to people who knew him before. Success had changed everything. He found Mrs. Rose. I just took too long to remember how much it matters. They talked for hours, and Carlos realized how much he had missed these genuine interactions. But reconnecting with his roots was only part of the transformation. He knew that if he wanted to prove to Luciana that he was changing, he needed to do more. Not to impress her, but to show that his words that night weren't empty. Carlos began visiting the school where Luciana worked. He didn't meet her immediately, but talked with some teachers and students. He discovered she had organized a project to create a community library, but faced difficulties raising funds. Without thinking twice, Carlos offered to help. He gathered old contacts, but this time with a different approach. He didn't want favors. He wanted these people to invest in something that really mattered. He presented Luciana's project with passion, highlighting its importance to the community. When the news reached Luciana that Carlos was involved. In funding the project, she was surprised. "I didn't do this to impress you, Luciana," he said when he finally found her in the school courtyard. "I did it because I believe in what you're doing." Luciana observed him for a moment, looking for signs of hidden intention in his expression, but all she found was sincerity. "It's a good start, Carlos," she said with a small smile. He knew it wasn't total acceptance, but it was enough to keep trying. Their relationship began to rebuild. Slowly, like a delicate bridge being constructed between past and present. They started meeting occasionally for coffee, talking about their lives and dreams. Carlos shared his journey of rediscovery, and Luciana listened with genuine interest. During one of these meetings, sitting in a small cafe with wooden tables and the welcoming aroma of freshly ground coffee beans, Carlos finally asked the question that had been on his mind. "Do you think we have a chance, Luciana?" She took a moment before responding, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "I think we have a chance to build something new, Carlos. Not what we had before, but something more mature, more real." He smiled, feeling hope bloom in his chest. "That's all I ask for. A chance to build something genuine with you." As winter approached, their relationship continued to evolve. They took things slowly, both aware that rushing could ruin everything they were carefully building. Carlos continued his work with community projects, not just the library, but other initiatives that could make a real difference in people's lives. Luciana watched his transformation with growing admiration, seeing that the changes weren't just superficial. They came from a genuine desire to reconnect with his true self. One evening, as they walked through the park where they used to dream as teenagers, Carlos stopped and turned to Luciana. "You know what I've learned these past months?" She looked at him, curiously. "What?" "That success isn't about where you live or what you own. It's about being true to yourself and making a difference in other people's lives. You tried to teach me that years ago, but I wasn't ready to understand." Luciana smiled, taking his hand. Maybe we both needed to grow to understand what really matters. As they continued their walk, both knew that while their story hadn't been perfect, it had led them exactly where they needed to be. They were no longer the dreaming teenagers from East London, nor were they the people they had been at the interrupted wedding. They were something new, stronger, wiser, and ready to build a future based on authenticity and mutual understanding. The sun was setting over London, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold as Carlos and Luciana walked hand in hand. They had no guarantee of what the future would bring, but they had something more valuable, the certainty that they were finally being true to themselves and to each other. And in the end, that was all that really mattered. Rose, an elderly neighbor who had known him since childhood, tending to her small garden. "Carlos Almeida," she exclaimed when she saw him. "I thought you'd forgotten where you came from." Carlos smiled, sitting beside her. "I never forgot, Mrs.